The views expressed in this course are those of the professor and do not necessarily reflect the position or policy of the U.S. Navy, the U.S. Department of Defense, or the U.S. government. Your lecturer is Professor Paul Rosenzweig. Professor Rosenzweig is a professorial lecturer in law at the George Washington University Law School, where he lectures on cybersecurity law and policy. He is a cum laude graduate of the University of Chicago Law School. Professor Rosenzweig is the founder of Red Branch Consulting, PLLC, a homeland security consulting company, and a senior advisor to the Chertoff Group. He formerly served as a Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy in the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, and he is currently a Distinguished Visiting Fellow at the Homeland Security Studies and Analysis Institute. Professor Rosenzweig is a senior editor of the Journal of National Security Law and Policy and the author of the recently released Cyber Warfare: How Conflicts in Cyberspace Are Challenging America and Changing the World.
In July 2010, a small computer security firm in Belarus announced that they'd discovered the signature of a new piece of malicious computer software, what we call malware. They gave this new virus an unassuming name, rootkit.temphider. And yet, despite the seemingly innocuous name, this piece of malware was something brand new. Some have called it the world's first cyber-guided missile. The way this new type of cyber threat has transformed the world, and quite possibly changed your life, is the subject of this course. Thank you for joining me as we explore what you need to know about cybersecurity. Together, over the next 18 lectures, we will be learning about the exciting and scary world of cybersecurity. What you'll come to see is that rootkit.temphider is really just the tip of the iceberg. Now, when the Belarus announcement was made, it was nothing unusual, hardly a surprise. After all, Symantec, that's the large cybersecurity firm that sells the Norton antivirus system, discovers more than 400 million new pieces of malware each year. That's for 2011. That's more than 12 new pieces of malware every second. Of course, most of what they look like and discover is simple. It looks a lot like older pieces of malware and is easily identified and rendered harmless. But this new virus, which eventually became known by the name of Stuxnet, was different, very different. In fact, it was so different that we find ourselves staring into a great unknown, just as those who invented air flight or the atomic bomb could not anticipate the consequences of those new technologies, so too Stuxnet is, I think, the harbinger of a changed world. Understanding why that is so is really the entire purpose of this course. In this series of lectures, we will, I think, frighten you a bit as we describe all of the malicious actors in cyberspace, but also, I hope, encourage you by describing how security measures are trying to keep up with the bad actors. At the end, you may be a little wary. The bad actors are still winning today. But you'll understand that the contest isn't hopeless. So let's start with Stuxnet itself. Up until the Stuxnet software was developed, The mantra of many experts was that the effects of cyber conflicts would be restricted to the cyber domain. As one wag put it, cyber war only kills a bunch of little baby electrons. Stuxnet showed the world that cyber war could potentially kill real babies. What Stuxnet did was infect a physical manufacturing plant, in this case, the uranium enrichment facility in Natanz, Iran, and make it malfunction. Using only a cyber virus, Iran's adversary made the machines break down. That's scary, because while Stuxnet only disrupted a uranium purification system, there's nothing at all that limits a cyber assault to uranium purification. The same type of system that runs the Iranian centrifuges also runs the systems that control the heat of their nuclear reactors. It is theoretically no harder to cause the centrifuges to break down than, say, to have graphite control rods pulled out, causing a nuclear meltdown. And if the Iranian facility at Natanz is vulnerable, so is the electric grid in New York City, or the Colorado River's Hoover Dam. Stuxnet was a piece of software code. At bottom, it was just a string of ones and zeros like any other program. Except, of course, this one was malevolent. Stuxnet used what experts call a two-phase attack. In other words, it had two parts. The first part was malware that infected a Windows-based Microsoft operating system. If you run Windows on your computer, then in theory, your computer was also a potential target. So let's call this the delivery phase of the program. The purpose of this delivery phase was to put the attack program in a system that might someday be attached to the target's control system. From this delivery platform, the malware was designed to jump to infect what is known as a SCADA system, a supervisory control and data acquisition system, in this case one manufactured by Siemens, the German manufacturing giant. In fact, Stuxnet targeted a very specific type of SCADA system software, the S7400 PLC software. And PLC, by the way, stands for Programmable Logic Controller. That's the generic name for the type of software controller that's used to operate large-scale machinery operations worldwide. Now, when Stuxnet jumped from the Microsoft operating system to the SCADA system, this was the attack phase of the program. The entire program required two phases for its attack because, not surprisingly, many SCADA systems that run sensitive or secret machinery are not directly connected to the Internet. A direct connection makes the system more vulnerable to intrusion, so operators add an additional layer of security by creating an air gap, that is, making sure that there are no connections between the system and the Internet. The Iranian nuclear enrichment program was almost certainly air-gapped from the broader Internet. So Stuxnet must have entered the SCADA system through some interaction it had with an external Windows-based program. Nobody quite knows how that happened. Perhaps it was introduced into the control program when an engineer hooked up a Windows-based tablet to collect data for diagnostic purposes. Perhaps it was on one of these, a thumb drive that was mistakenly plugged into a Windows operating interface system. Or, more creatively, it might have been introduced on purpose by a spy who infiltrated the facility for the purpose of introducing the worm into the system. Personally, I kind of enjoy that cloak and dagger image, especially when combined with the high-tech idea of a computer virus. In truth, though, we'll probably never know for sure. Whatever the method of introduction, the second phase of the attack demonstrated a large degree of sophistication. It was designed to target only a single, particular type of operating system, a bit like a precision-guided missile seeking a specific house to bomb. And in identifying its target within the Iranian nuclear enrichment facility, Stuxnet's developers exhibited a significant degree of insider knowledge. They knew exactly what to attack and how to do so. Before we discuss the actual target, however, we have to back up just a bit and talk about uranium and enrichment. As you probably remember, back around 2008 and 2009, many in the West became concerned that Iran was developing a nuclear weapon. It probably still is. That effort, combined with its rather extreme rhetoric, raised the hackles of many in the West. It turns out that the uranium that occurs in nature isn't pure enough to work as a nuclear fuel in a reactor. And it also isn't pure enough to work as an explosive material for an atomic bomb. Uranium ore has to be purified to be of real value. And one part of the process of purification requires that a bunch of centrifuges spin at a constant rate of speed. And when we say constant, we mean really, really constant, with very little variation. So it isn't surprising that we use computers, these SCADA systems we've been talking about, to precisely control the speed of the rotors that spin the nuclear centrifuges. When they work right, these SCADA systems can be very precise. The Stuxnet attack changed all that. It manipulated the speed of the centrifuge rotors to make them slow down and then speed up. The variations in speed were designed to slowly wear down and ultimately crack the rotors. Because Stuxnet made the centrifuges run at a highly variable rate, the uranium produced was impure and unsuitable for use. Along the way, Stuxnet also disabled and bypassed several digitally operated safety systems that were designed to make sure that the centrifuges ran at a fixed and safe rate of speed. It's worth pausing for a minute to think about this, because it really is something new and different. Here we have a piece of computer malware having a real-world effect. In this case, the real-world effect was to break some rotors in a centrifuge. But once we start down that road, well, almost anything is possible. Any physical system that is operated by a computer system like the SCADA system is at least now theoretically vulnerable to attack and possible destruction. And perhaps not so theoretically. In 2007, the Department of Homeland Security ran a test at one of our national labs in Idaho. The test was known as Aurora, and it involved a malicious computer program. The program worked on a diesel generator, one that isn't too different from the diesel generators used in electricity generating facilities all across America, and in fact, across much of the world. There's a video of the test, and it's really quite incredible. During the test, nobody touches the generator physically. But by the end of the test, black smoke is pouring from the machine. That's definitely not what the engineers had in mind for this piece of machinery. What happened was that the Idaho computer scientists put some malware into the SCADA program. Not Stuxnet, but a moderately close cousin probably. And instead of breaking rotors, they made the generator run itself to death and burn itself out. Now that's pretty scary. Between Aurora and Stuxnet, you can understand why policymakers, lawyers, military leaders around the globe are concerned. Not only did Stuxnet have physical effects, it also hid them. Stuxnet was a surreptitious piece of malware. Buried within the program was a pre-recorded series of data reports on the operation of the centrifuges. Now, of course, SCADA systems regularly provide reports to the operators about how the machinery is working. While Stuxnet was causing the centrifuges to operate poorly, it was using pre-recorded data to falsely report to the operators that everything was in working order. Think of the movie Ocean's 11, where the robber heroes play a pre-recorded tape of what is happening in the vault they're robbing to cover their true activities, and you get an idea of how the Stuxnet worm covered its tracks. Iran has, understandably, been unwilling to say much publicly about how badly it was hurt by Stuxnet. At a minimum, confirmed reports suggest that the malware destroyed 1,000 centrifuges at the Natanz facility. One Israeli analyst told the Jerusalem Post that Stuxnet may have set the Iran nuclear program back by at least 2 years. Of course, as in the real world, Sometimes even the most precise missiles cause some collateral damage. Though Stuxnet was targeted at the Iranian Natanz nuclear processing facility, according to Symantec, that's the computer security firm, by September 29, 2010, there were 100,000 computer servers infected with Stuxnet in the world. Now, approximately 60% of those were in Iran. The next 5 countries to experience the most Stuxnet infections were Indonesia, India, the United States, Azerbaijan, and the United Kingdom, respectively. But all things considered, the targeting was pretty precise. The only place where the virus actually turned on and broke things, at least the only place we know about, was at Natanz. So, who did it? At least on the official record, nobody knows for sure. There's been no decisive demonstration of attribution of responsibility for the Stuxnet malware. But there's been a lot of educated, and maybe less than educated, speculation. For example, some people think that there are hints about the authorship of the worm buried in the malicious code itself. Pieces of evidence that allegedly are signatures, demonstrating that Israel wrote the Stuxnet code. One piece of evidence is the prominence within the code of the number 19790509, which, when you invert it, might be a reference to the date May 9, 1979, which happens to also be the day a prominent Iranian Jew was executed by Ayatollah Khomeini's government. Indeed, if this were a mystery novel, then the Israelis would have the means, motive, and opportunity to have committed the crime. And they have a powerful incentive to degrade Iranian nuclear progress. But so do others, including the United States. In fact, the New York Times reported that the 2 countries actually cooperated in the production of Stuxnet, using American know-how to build the worm and then test it at Israel's Dimona complex in the Negev desert. According to the New York Times, the Stuxnet worm was tested on centrifuges identical to those at the Natanz nuclear facility that the United States got from Libya. One other indicator: Stuxnet may have been just the last phase of a larger sabotage program known as FLAME. According to a 2012 report in the Washington Post, the United States and Israel jointly developed FLAME to collect intelligence in preparation for the Stuxnet cyber sabotage attacks. This massive piece of malware, it's the largest we've ever seen, was designed to secretly map Iran's computer networks and monitor the computers of Iranian officials, sending back a steady stream of intelligence. Apparently, someone used that information to make sure that Stuxnet hit its target. And here's the fun part. Although FLAME came first in time, Stuxnet was discovered first by outsiders. Now, that's confusing, isn't it? Okay, so what's the big deal? Cyber viruses can have real-world effects. Is that really any different than what, say, a grenade or a mortar attack can do? Maybe not. But from another perspective, this change in capabilities may be as world-shaking, metaphorically speaking, of course, as the explosion of the first atomic bomb. When in July 1945, the first experimental bomb was exploded, J. Robert Oppenheimer, the scientist who led the Los Alamos development efforts, immediately recognized the significance of the event. As he recounted some years later in an interview, quote, "We knew the world would not be the same. I remembered the line from the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu says, 'Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.' I suppose we all thought that, one way or another." But even Oppenheimer barely understood the significance of the changes that arose from the first atomic bomb. At the time, he recognized its destructive power and the transformative effect it would have on war-making, but nobody could, at the dawn of the nuclear age, anticipate its long-term social, psychological, and geopolitical effects. Looking back now, with the perspective of more than 65 years, we can see some of those changes. From the first atomic bomb came nuclear power, and cheaper electricity. But it also brought us new ways of thinking about war, like the concept of mutually assured destruction, the counterintuitive idea that world peace is better maintained through the hyper-development of destructive capacity. This led to the equally counterintuitive view that defense is destabilizing. If missile defenses work, then mutually assured destruction doesn't. As a result, we concluded that defending yourself was dangerous and maybe even immoral. We effectively banned all defensive technologies through the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. In the broader field of world geopolitics, nuclear weapons also wrought unexpected changes. In an extended sense, the existence of atomic weapons mandated a policy of containment rather than confrontation, since nuclear war was too grave to risk. And from the policy of containment flowed the Cold War, the Marshall Plan, NATO, and ultimately limited wars in Korea and Vietnam. Now, at the beginning of the nuclear era, all of these developments were unanticipated glimmers on the far horizon, unseen by anyone who witnessed the first atomic explosion. Atomic weapons were utterly transformative. Cyberspace is no different. We've had an easy, some would say too easy time, exploiting the benefits of the internet. Now, however, it seems as though the vulnerabilities threaten to overwhelm the benefits. The internet is a bit of a wild and dangerous place where our secrets and even our identities are increasingly at risk. Viruses like Stuxnet that threaten our critical infrastructure are but the most extreme example of those vulnerabilities. Like the explosion of the atomic bomb, we can't even begin to predict what the future holds. But events like Stuxnet tell us that the changes will be very great indeed. Stuxnet was a proof of concept that cyber war can be real. And as the Department of Homeland Security has noted, now that information about Stuxnet is publicly available, it's a lot easier for other bad actors to develop variants that target other SCADA systems around the world. Because SCADA systems are pervasive and generic, the Stuxnet worm is, essentially, a blueprint for a host of infrastructure attacks. The American demonstration that nuclear weapons were capable of manufacture assured the Soviets that their efforts would eventually succeed. Similarly, the proof through Stuxnet that cyber attacks can have kinetic effects has opened up a whole world of possibilities for malware designers. Many of those possibilities are potentially catastrophic. If you doubt the last proposition, consider that the largest SCADA system in the world is run by Gazprom, the massive Russian gas and oil producer. That ought to give anyone pause. Imagine what would happen if someone used a Stuxnet variant to destroy the pipeline system that ships oil and gas to Europe, or to blow up the largest Russian petroleum processing plant. Or think of this possibility. Maybe Stuxnet wasn't really intended to have that great an effect. Maybe the damage to Iran's nuclear program was just a useful collateral benefit to a larger purpose, that of sending a message to the Iranians that even their most sensitive programs were vulnerable. This is sometimes called an info hack, where the purpose is more to let your opponent know that he is vulnerable, and therefore should be cautious and circumspect in his actions, than it is to achieve any particular result. Indeed, some strategic cyber analysts are convinced, albeit without any direct evidence, that Stuxnet was not the only payload delivered to the Iranian systems. After all, having gone to the significant effort of getting inside the Iranian system, why stop at disrupting the uranium enrichment centrifuges? A sensible adversary may have left behind other payloads with the capability of far more significant disruptions. Payloads that are virtually impossible to detect and scrub from an existing control system. The most profound similarities between atomic weapons and cyber threats, however, lie in the disruptive nature of the Stuxnet event. Imagine what it must have been like the day after the first atomic bomb was exploded. Around the globe, settled assumptions about war, policy, foreign affairs, and law had, in an instant, all come unglued. Even 17 years after the atomic bomb was first exploded, The uncertainty about their use and the threat they posed was so great that the Cuban Missile Crisis nearly engulfed the world in nuclear war. We're about to experience that same sort of tumultuous time. And as of the date of this lecture, nobody in America, except a very few people who are concerned senior policymakers, really knows it. Furthermore, and perhaps more ominously, even at the dawn of the nuclear age, we were confident that we could identify anyone who used atomic weapons, and that they could all be peer nation-state actors. In the cyber realm, by contrast, we have much greater difficulty identifying who fires the weapon. And indeed, the culprit may well be a non-state actor, perhaps terrorists, or even a relatively small group of dedicated hackers of the sort we'll talk about in later lectures. It's difficult, if not impossible, to know for sure. In short, we stand on the threshold of a new world, much like we did in 1945. And from this vantage point, nobody can really say where the future might lead. But what we can say is that the changes that lie ahead will affect everyone on the planet in ways great and small. And that means that the more you know about where we are today, the better prepared you will be for the future. The binary system of counting, which uses ones and zeros, lies at the heart of the cyberspace revolution. Every number, every bit of data, every voice communication, every video can in essence be expressed as a string of ones and zeros. In physical terms, deep within the innards of the computer, silicon chips create those ones and zeros through a series of transistors whose structure is etched into wafer-thin silicon integrated circuits. The beauty of cyberspace and its genius lies in recognizing the universal power of these simple ones and zeros. The rapidity with which they can be manipulated has, over the past decades, increased exponentially. And that explosion in computing power has fostered a wild explosion of new technology. Hardly a day goes by without some development of some new computer application that is intended to enhance our lives. Indeed, they've become so ubiquitous that we now have a shorthand word for them. We call them apps. America's increasing utilization of, reliance on, and dependence upon technology for our social infrastructure is changing how we live our lives. We even have things like Cyber Monday for our Christmas shopping. The pace of our technological advances has significant implications for how individuals interact, for how the economy functions, for how the government and the private sector conduct business, and ultimately, for how we protect our national interests and provide for our common defense. Cyberspace is everywhere, and it's part of our everyday activities. But precisely because it's so pervasive, that means that our dependence on cyberspace creates new risks and dangers. If you want a shorthand way of thinking about this course, it's about our struggle to have our cake and eat it too, about how we try to reap the benefits in productivity and information sharing that come from a globalized web of cyber connections, while somehow managing to avoid, or at least reduce, the damage done by the bad actors who seek to exploit that globalized web for their own reasons. Like most efforts to eat cake without gaining weight, our labors cannot reasonably be expected to be fully successful. So our struggle can only be to minimize the threats as best we can while maximizing the benefits. This struggle is the newest conflict for the current generation. The nature of that conflict changes on a daily basis. But unless something deeply surprising happens, the specter of cyber warfare and the reality of a broader cyber conflict, which includes espionage, terrorism, and crime, are all with us for the foreseeable future. Of course, in cyberspace, things change all the time. So some of the specifics we talk about may be overtaken by events by the time you take this course. But the fundamental premise of this course is that it will not become dated. The enduring principles that underlie our struggle, the need to identify risks and minimize them while maximizing our benefits, those won't change. So this course will proceed in a relatively simple fashion. We're going to begin, appropriately enough, at the beginning. We'll start with a look at how the Internet and cyberspace are built and why they are built the way they are. It turns out that a lot of the vulnerability is built into the system from the start. We'll also spend some time looking more closely at the different types of viruses and vulnerabilities that are infecting the cyber domain. And we'll close the introductory portion of this course by trying to get a different feel for who the different actors are in cyberspace. There is a world of difference between the motivations of, say, China or the United States and those of cyber hackers. And both of them are very different from organized crime. In the second part of the course, we'll start to look at some of the issues of law and policy that are bound up in our dealing with these threats. We'll look, for example, at how the Constitution both protects our civil liberties and possibly limits our ability to protect ourselves. We'll ask some questions about encryption policy as a way of protecting ourselves. And we'll take a dive into the topic known as big data, the idea that everyone leaves a cyber trail in cyberspace for others to see and use. The third and last part of the course steps back a bit from our look at particular policies and tries to put the problem in context. We'll look at how to make the entire network more resilient. I'll give you some tips on how to best protect yourself. And finally, we'll do some crystal ball gazing and look at what the next 10 or 20 years may hold for us. And at the end of it all, Stuxnet may still scare you, but you'll have a better idea of exactly why it's scary and what we, collectively, are trying to do about it. You will, I hope, understand that it is impossible to eliminate all the risks of cyberspace. There are no silver bullets out there. All we can do is recognize the incredible value of cyberspace and accept the risks that come with it, all the while working to manage those risks and minimize them as best we can. So, welcome on board. I hope you enjoy the journey.